So about a year ago, at least by the time this video comes out, I made a video on whether I thought the modern Paper Mario games were really that bad. The conclusion I ended up coming to was that while I did enjoy Color Splash and Origami King, all three of the games in what I guess you could call the modern Paper Mario trilogy are just fundamentally flawed. Sticker Star is a game beyond redemption, but Color Splash and Origami King are games that I thought had some really cool stuff in them and can genuinely be pretty fun sometimes, which made their problems all the more frustrating, which may or may not be similar to how I feel about another game we may or may not be talking about today. But my main reason for bringing up that video is that I got a few comments asking why I didn't really include Super Paper Mario in my discussion. My personal reason for that was I didn't really feel like it fit the video, since the focus of the video was what made the classic Paper Mario games work, and whether or not the modern games could still be enjoyable without some of those things. The reason Super Paper Mario didn't fit into that is because I don't think it's a game that fits in either category of Paper Mario games, and is honestly just more of its own thing. I have seen a lot of people online say that they really like Super Paper Mario, or that it's one of their favorites in the series. So today, I wanted to take a look back at this game because it has admittedly been quite a while since I played it last, and finally decide if I think that Super Paper Mario is really that good. To start off, I feel it's important to talk about what this game actually is, because like I said earlier, it's not really like anything else in the series. Unlike all of the other games that are either RPGs or crappy imitations of an RPG, this game is actually a platformer with RPG elements mixed into it. Basically, what this means is that the game plays like a pretty typical 2D Mario platformer, except both you and your enemies have stats like attack, defense, and health, which for the player can all be upgraded by leveling up, which you do by defeating enemies. You also have multiple characters you can switch between on the fly, and little helper creatures called pixels that give you different abilities. But the main noticeable thing is that you are able to sometimes switch the perspective of the game from 2D to 3D. This was sort of the main marketing gimmick of the game, and in concept, it's pretty cool. But we'll get into this later. So I guess to go ahead and rip the band-aid off, I'll just go ahead and say that I don't really like the gameplay of this game. The idea of a platformer mixed with an RPG is a really fun idea to me, since platformers are my thing, and RPGs are something that I can enjoy when I think they are done well or in an interesting way. So blending the two together could make an RPG that I'm pretty on board with. Problem is though, they didn't make a very good platformer. The movement in this game is pretty limited, but it isn't bad in any way and could be just fine as long as the game is designed well around it. I just don't think it is though. The platforming rarely gets all that complicated, and the game just seems to rely on just placing more enemies when they want to increase the difficulty a bit. I couldn't tell you how many sections of this game are just flat, straight lines with enemies placed in them, which would be more acceptable in a normal Paper Mario RPG, but in a game like this that is partly platformer, that's just lame. The combat isn't really that fun either, since it's been heavily simplified to be more like a normal Mario game, meaning that it basically just consists of you jumping on an enemy over and over again until they die. This did lead to some boss fights that I thought were fun, but fighting normal enemies is just kind of a drag. I think the main problem here is that the game plays like a platformer, but is still very much designed like an RPG, which means that the platforming never really gets a chance to shine. Then we have the whole swapping to 3D gimmick, which I think could have been very interesting because it could have allowed for both 2D and 3D platforming sections to be in the same game, but then they added this stupid little timer, meaning that you can only be in 3D for a limited amount of time. Then they said only Mario can go into 3D and not any of the other characters. I think the reason they made 3D exclusive to Mario is that all of the other characters have different abilities and benefits to using them, and I guess they felt like Mario needed something to keep you playing as him. But all this really ends up doing is just make me not want to use the 3D feature as often, since I have to completely stop what I'm doing and swap characters. And then when I do, chances are there won't even be anything worthwhile to see or get in 3D. This stupid timer doesn't help with that, since they had to make everything you can do in 3D doable within the time limit, meaning that there aren't any real platforming sections or anything meaningful within 3D. Now, the only punishment for staying in 3D longer than the time limit is that you lose 1 health, and then the meter resets, which is honestly a pretty lenient punishment that kind of encourages you to stay in 3D longer. which just begs the question of why it's there in the first place. The game never takes advantage of or uses the time limit in any clever way, so it just feels like it doesn't need to be there. It also doesn't help that I feel like they could have done way more interesting stuff if it wasn't there. The farther I got into the game, the more annoying I found it to have to swap to 3D because it always felt super forced and completely interrupted the flow of whatever I was doing. And don't even try to attack enemies while in this mode because it is an absolute nightmare to try and jump on top of something that is completely flat. To be completely honest though, most of my problems with the game so far can be overlooked and I can still enjoy the game despite some of those issues. What I can't stand though is when the game comes to a complete halt just to have you find some random item or code. This isn't just something that happens once or twice. So much of this game is just wandering around in circles for ages trying to find out what to do. A lot of the time the game isn't even super clear on what you need to find, which make these sections even more annoying. And then sometimes when you find what you need, actually using that information is way more annoying than actually getting it. For example, there's this part of the game where you see these 3 blocks that can all be hit. To find out what order to hit the blocks, you have to talk to this rock guy back at the town. After hitting the blocks in the right order, you then go through the door it opened. In that area, you find 3 more blocks that are set up just like the first 3. What you have to do is then go back to the guy who gave you the first combination to give you the next one. Already, that seems a little repetitive and pointless, but nothing that annoying. Then he gives you the code. It's just super long, and you have to either take notes or pictures to remember what he said. It's not hard, it didn't take that long, but it's just annoying and inconvenient, all just to pad out the length of the game a bit. So much of this game just feels like it's there for padding, like the chapter where you're in space. The final level and boss of that chapter, in my opinion, is actually kinda fun, but the entire build-up to it is annoying and tedious. Honestly, I wouldn't call any of the chapters before the final one good, but instead they all just have good moments. The final chapter of the game was definitely my favorite part of the game, both for the actual levels as well as the story, which we will get into later. This part of the game is probably the most straightforward out of all of the chapters and didn't make itself any longer than it really needed to be. You have a few puzzles with some enemy encounters and then some bosses at the end of each level. It's nice, it gets to the point, and I wish more of the game was like this. Okay, so I'm assuming that by this point in the video, most of the Super Paper Mario fans probably hate me, but now I would like to go into some stuff that I actually did like. While the execution of most chapters I found pretty weak just due to the gameplay, I did like a lot of the ideas that were shown off. This game's highlights are the weird characters and story moments sprinkled in between the tedious gameplay. So much stuff in this game I found genuinely interesting or really funny, like the entire Francis section, which is just making fun of terminally online losers, and it has aged surprisingly well. The first half of the game definitely has a much more lighthearted tone to it, but the further you go, it gets more weird and interesting. You have the rock people who are being mind controlled by the flower people, but it turns out they were only doing that because the rock people threw a bunch of trash in their water that caused their king to go mad. Then there's the part of the game where Mario goes to hell before he dies, and just a bunch of other stuff that I think works really well. Even the more computery shape look that all the areas and NPCs have, I find interesting and I think makes the game stand out more. This game feels so different from the first 2 Paper Mario games, even outside of the gameplay changes, and even if it's not my favorite, I can respect it a lot for that. But the one thing that I think sets this game apart more than anything else is the story. I'm not usually the kind of guy who puts a lot of time into reviewing the stories of games because it's just not usually the reason that I play a game. Plus, most of the games I like don't really have much when it comes to story. I'm the kind of guy who values gameplay more than anything else when it comes to video games. So even if you have a really good video game story, if you don't have good gameplay to go with it, I'm probably not going to like it. And sadly, I think that's sort of the case with this game. I say sadly because I genuinely really enjoyed the story of this game. It was kind of the only thing keeping me coming back besides the fact that I was making a video. At the beginning of the game, it really doesn't seem that interesting or different from other Mario RPGs. A new bad guy comes in and wants to end the world. But the difference is, unlike most other villains from these games, they aren't just evil because the game needs an antagonist. They have an actual backstory and a reason they are doing what they are doing, which isn't very common in a Mario game. Well, the first villain does, the surprise reveal final boss doesn't really, but he's still cool, so we'll excuse it. Honestly, I don't want to spoil it too much because if you're somehow not in the loop and have no clue what happens in this game, the story is kind of the only reason I would suggest playing this game if it interests you. I will say though, the story doesn't really get that interesting until closer to the end, so you're gonna have to go through some more boring parts to get to the good stuff. But the ending especially just really leaves you feeling actual emotions, which hey, that's a new one. New Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't do that for me. Honestly, I think what disappoints me the most about this game is just the fact that I don't like it that much. I like the story, I think the setting and all the different places you go to are very interesting, but the gameplay just isn't that good, and I have a lot of trouble getting past that. If this game was a more traditional Paper Mario game, I think it could genuinely rival Thousand Year Door as the best. But the way it is now, well, I like it more than Sticker Star.